Last week we discussed brains in Vats, and I said this week we would talk about a famous response by Putnam. So if you haven't seen last week's video, then I recommend you go watch it now. Link to the original paper by Putnam is in the description. I think you should check that out as well. It's a good paper, but here is an explanation of Putnam's position. Take an ant crawling its way round in the sand, and during its time crawling it traces a picture that resembles Winston Churchill. Strange, I know, bear with me. Now, does this image represent Winston Churchill? Putnam states that, with little thought on the matter, we will come to the decision that this does not, in fact, represent Churchill. Also, if the ant had traced the words Winston Churchill, we also would not say that the lines traced represent Winston Churchill, even though that is what they appear to say. If resemblance then is not what is necessary or sufficient for representation, then what is? If the ant had instead heard or seen of Churchill, and had in turn made this image or word, then the image produced could be said to represent Churchill, as the image had been made with intention of representation. Images therefore can only represent if they have an intention behind them. Now let's consider an alien planet populated by humans. On this planet, there are no trees. There have never been any trees, no sort of vegetation like trees. People on this planet have absolutely no understanding in any shape or form what a tree is. Now say an image of a tree mysteriously ended up on that planet. The humans could look at this image and wonder, what is it? Is it some kind of shelter? An animal perhaps? Is it a strange form of art? They simply would not be able to know what it is. Now say someone has a mental image about the tree, exactly the same as mine. Now I don't mean to brag here, but I have seen a tree before. Now this alien's thought is not a representation of a tree, but instead a representation of a strange thing on this piece of paper. But one could say, as it is indeed a picture of a tree, there is a causal link between a tree and the thought in the alien human's mind, and therefore their thought is a representation of a tree. Now, Hilary Putnam's a smart guy. He's thought about this too. Suppose this isn't actually a picture of a tree, but merely an ink spill that just so happens to look this way. Again, very unlikely, but bear with me. This image then would have as much representational power as our ant's depiction of Churchill, yet the alien humans have produced thoughts qualitatively the same as our own. And our own represents the tree, but theirs does not. The same, of course, could be said of words. Imagine the famous infinite monkeys at a typewriter eventually typing Shakespeare. This is obviously different from, the intention that Shakespeare had when he wrote it down. What these experiments have shown is that though this seems improbable, it is possible. And that depictions are not representations because they resemble other things, whether they are mental or physical depictions. They resemble other things because there is an intention there. Now, how is this related to the discussion on brains in vats that we had last week?
We get there when we get there!
Consider Alan Turing's Turing test. I won't explain the test here, but essentially it is that a machine is said to be conscious if, when compared with a human, a person cannot tell them apart. This is done by the said person having conversations with the machine and a human and asking them if they could tell them apart. If they could, then the machine fails. If they couldn't, then the machine passes. Now, it is conceivably possible that a machine could be constructed that could simply be made to play this imitation game without understanding anything going on in the conversation. It seems to refer to the objects it discusses, but has no understanding of what they are, just at best how the words it uses link to other words and how to use them correctly to play this sort of imitation game and play it well. It is even conceivable, yet very, very unlikely, that this sort of machine simply spawned from nowhere into a world where nothing exists but itself, and there is absolutely no causal link with the words it uses and what those words refer to. Now, let's get back to brains in vats. It is conceivable, no matter how unlikely, that there is a universe that simply began as brains in vats. These brains communicate with each other inside a simulation about trees, in the same way that we would. Now, the brains in the vats may be having the exact same experience we are qualitatively. When they talk, though, they aren't referring to anything real, like we do. At best, they are referring to the simulation in much the same way that the alien humans aren't referring to a tree, but simply an ink spillage that looks like a tree. We are almost there, I swear, we're almost there, we're almost back. So if this possibility is actually the real world and the universe spawned as brains in vats, and that is what we are And this is all a hallucination of the external world. Now let's consider what we are trying to articulate when we say we are brains in vats. When I say brain, the image being represented can only be that of a brain in the simulation, not that of anything external, as there is nothing it can be causally linked to. It is the same with the word vat. It has to be inside the simulation, as there's nothing it can be externally linked to. Both of these words would represent an external actual brain and vat about as well as the ant's Churchill or the spilled ink represent Churchill or a tree respectively. Therefore, when we say we are brains in vats, what we are expressing, and could only be expressing, is that we are brains in vats in the simulation we are currently in. But this is obviously false, as if we are indeed in that simulation, I am in a body in the simulation. I can see it right now. The idea, therefore, that I am a brain in a vat causes a contradiction, as it cannot be true without proving itself false. Whatever we are then, we're not brains in vats. Or at least in this very specific circumstance. Putnam's argument is impressive, no doubt, but does it really tell us anything? It doesn't really deal with the skeptic's challenge. All it seems to do is say in this very specific circumstance we are not brains in vats, but we still have strong reason to be skeptical about the external world. If your opponent does set up this very specific set of circumstances, then knock them down. It's probably what they wanted, to be fair. Anything else though, you're high and dry. What do you think? Do you find Putnam convincing? Or do you think, like me, it's good in the circumstances that has been set up, but everywhere else it's pretty useless? Or would you go even further and say it even fails to set up Putnam's ridiculously specific setup? Let me know in the comments below. Anyway, that was part 2 of Brains in Vats. I hope you guys enjoyed. Remember, if you like this video, like, comment and subscribe. Ring that bell for notifications. Follow my socials in the description, along with my subreddit and the Mythology Multiverse Discord. My TIL vids is down there too if you're on YouTube, and my YouTube if you're on TIL. And as always, I will see you next week, babies.